The wolf didn't snap when she reached for him, and that should have been her first warning that nothing about this encounter would be ordinary. The second warning was that he was still breathing despite the bullet wound through his shoulder and the pool of crimson spreading beneath his silver coat. But the third warning, the one that would change Vera Sinclair's life forever, was the way his amber eyes held hers with an intelligence that seemed almost human, as if he was trying to tell her something that words could never convey. Most wounded animals would have fought with desperate fury, but this massive Modoc wolf simply watched her approach through the morning mist of Devil's Canyon Pass, his breathing shallow but steady, his magnificent head never wavering from her face. Blood matted his thick winter coat, and his powerful frame trembled with exhaustion, yet there was something regal about the way he lay there, like a king waiting for his subjects to recognize his nobility. Vera had seen plenty of violence in her 3 years running the trading post at the most dangerous passage through the Sierra Nevada mountains. Bandits, claim jumpers, and desperate men fleeing the law had taught her to expect treachery around every boulder and betrayal behind every smile. But she had never encountered anything like the wounded predator who had somehow dragged himself to her doorstep in the pre-dawn darkness, leaving a trail of blood that told a story of determination that defied natural instinct. Vera had risen before sunrise, as was her habit during the early autumn months when the trading routes through Devil's Canyon Pass saw their heaviest traffic. The morning air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter, and frost covered the wooden planks of her porch like scattered diamonds. She had been preparing to check her supply of ammunition and whiskey, the two commodities most in demand among the rough men who frequented her isolated outpost, when she heard the sound that made her blood freeze in her veins. It wasn't not quite a howl, not entirely a whimper, but something that spoke of pain, endured with dignity. The sound came from the direction of the narrow trail that wound down from the higher elevations, where the ancient Modoc hunting paths intersected with the newer routes carved by gold prospectors and cattle drivers. Vera grabbed her Winchester rifle from its rack beside the door, her movements automatic after years of living alone in territory where the line between civilization and wilderness remained dangerously thin. What she found beside the wooden water trough that served both human travelers and their animals defied every expectation she had developed about the natural world. The wolf was enormous, easily the largest specimen she had ever seen, with coat coloring that seemed to shift between silver and grey, depending on how the early morning light touched his fur. His paws were the size of a man's hands, his shoulders broad enough to suggest incredible strength, and his head bore the noble proportions that marked him as an alpha, the kind of predator that other animals instinctively feared and respected. But it was his eyes that stopped Vera in her tracks. Most wild animals, especially wounded ones, showed only fear or aggression when confronted by humans. This wolf's amber gaze held something entirely different, a depth of intelligence that seemed to recognize her not as a threat or potential prey, but as someone who might understand the gravity of his situation. There was dignity in those eyes, and pain, and something that almost looked like hope. The bullet wound in his left shoulder was clean, suggesting it had come from a rifle rather than the crude handguns favored by most of the outlaws who haunted the canyon passes. Someone had shot this magnificent creature with deliberate precision, aiming to wound rather than kill, which raised questions that made Vera's stomach clench with unease. Professional hunters killed quickly and efficiently. Only someone with a deeper, more personal motivation would choose to wound such a powerful predator and then apparently abandon him to die slowly. Vera set her rifle aside and approached the wolf with the same careful movements she used when dealing with spooked horses or injured cattle. Her father had taught her that wounded animals could sense fear and aggression, and that patience was often the difference between successful treatment and a fatal mistake. The wolf watched her every step, his breathing labored, but his gaze never wavering from her face. "Easy there, big fellow," she murmured, her voice soft and steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I'm not here to hurt you. Looks like someone else already took care of that." The wolf's ears twitched at the sound of her words, and she could have sworn she saw something like understanding flicker across his expression. When she knelt beside him, close enough to see the individual strands of silver in his thick coat, the wolf made no move to defend himself. Instead, he seemed to relax slightly, as if her proximity brought him some measure of comfort. Vera had treated plenty of injured animals during her years at the trading post, horses with broken legs, cattle with infected wounds, even the occasional injured prospector's mule. But she had never worked with a predator this size or this obviously intelligent. The bullet had passed cleanly through the muscle of his shoulder, missing the major blood vessels but causing enough tissue damage to severely limit his mobility. The wound was perhaps 6 hours old, judging by the amount of blood loss and the way the edges had begun to clot. Whoever had shot him had done so sometime during the night, probably in the higher elevations where the old Modoc trails wound through the dense pine forests. Vera tore strips from her cotton petticoat to create makeshift bandages, her movements careful and deliberate. The wolf never flinched when she pressed the cloth against his wound, though she could feel the powerful muscles of his shoulder trembling beneath her touch. His fur was incredibly thick and soft, nothing like the coarse hair of the mangy coyotes that sometimes scavenged around her property. This was the coat of an animal that had lived well, had been cared for, had never known hunger or neglect. "Someone's been looking after you, haven't they?" she whispered as she worked to clean the wound with water from her well. "This isn't your first encounter with humans, is it? You're too calm, too trusting. Someone taught you that not all of us are dangerous." The wolf's response was a soft sound, barely audible, that somehow conveyed both gratitude and profound sadness. The process of moving him into her small barn required more strength than Vera had realized she possessed. The wolf was dead weight, his powerful frame limp with exhaustion and blood loss, but he made no effort to resist her attempts to help him. She fashioned a travois from spare lumber and canvas, the same technique her father had taught her for, moving injured cattle, and slowly dragged him across the 20 yards of open ground between the water trough and the shelter of her barn. Inside the barn, she created a bed of fresh hay and covered it with her warmest blankets, wool that had cost her a month's profits from the trading post, but which now seemed like a small price to pay for the comfort of a creature that had somehow earned her protection. The wolf settled into the makeshift bed with a sigh that sounded almost human, his amber eyes closing for the first time since she had discovered him. Vera spent the entire first night in the barn, sitting beside the wounded wolf with her rifle, across her knees and a pot of coffee growing cold at her elbow. She had learned from experience that injured animals were most vulnerable during the hours of darkness, when pain and shock could overwhelm their systems and tip them from recovery toward death. But her vigil was motivated by more than practical concern. Something about this particular animal compelled her attention in ways she couldn't rationally explain. The wolf slept fitfully, his powerful frame twitching with dreams that seemed to involve running across vast distances. Occasionally he would whimper softly, sounds that spoke of loss and longing rather than physical pain. During these moments, Vera found herself reaching out to stroke his thick fur, her touch seeming to calm whatever visions were disturbing his rest. His coat was warmer than she had expected, and she could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palm, evidence of strength that might yet pull him through this ordeal. As the hours passed, Vera began to notice details about her unexpected patient that deepened the mystery of his origins. His claws showed signs of regular wear against stone and earth, suggesting he had covered enormous distances in his travels. His teeth, visible when he panted in his sleep, were white and sharp, but showed none of the excessive wear that marked animals forced to survive on carrion or inadequate prey. His muscle tone, even weakened by injury and blood loss, spoke of a creature that had lived an active, healthy life under someone's careful stewardship. Most telling were the scars. As Vera examined his coat more thoroughly, she discovered evidence of previous encounters with both wild animals and human weapons. A long, thin mark across his ribs suggested a knife blade that had come dangerously close to vital organs. Smaller scars around his muzzle and ears told of battles with other predators, probably wolves defending territory or competing for mates. But there were also marks that could only have come from human tools. A perfectly straight line across his left haunch that matched the pattern of a whip, and what looked like rope burns around his powerful neck. "Someone's been training you," Vera murmured as she traced these old injuries with gentle fingers. "But not breaking you. These marks tell a story of discipline, not cruelty. Someone spent a lot of time teaching you to trust humans, to work with them instead of against them." The wolf's ears flicked at the sound of her voice, though his eyes remained closed in exhausted sleep. Near midnight, the wolf's condition seemed to worsen. His breathing became more labored, and his body temperature dropped to levels that made Vera genuinely fear for his survival. She wrapped additional blankets around his frame and moved her coffee pot close enough that the residual heat might provide some warmth. When these measures proved insufficient, she made a decision that surprised her with its spontaneity. She lay down beside the wounded animal, sharing her body heat in the same way she had once warmed orphaned calves during harsh winters. The wolf's response was immediate and profound. His breathing steadied, his body relaxed, and for the first time since she had discovered him, his sleep seemed peaceful rather than tormented. Vera felt the steady rise and fall of his massive chest against her back, and the sensation was oddly comforting. She had been alone at the trading post for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to share space with another living being, even one as unexpected as a wounded predator. Dawn brought the first sign that the wolf might actually survive his ordeal. When Vera opened her eyes, she found him watching her with those remarkable amber eyes, his head raised and his ears alert to the sounds of morning activity outside the barn. The improvement in his condition was dramatic. His breathing was stronger, his body temperature had returned to normal levels, and there was an alertness in his expression that suggested the worst of the crisis had passed. Vera prepared a mixture of beef broth and water, uncertain whether a wild predator would accept food from human hands, but determined to offer whatever nourishment she could provide. The wolf's response exceeded her most optimistic expectations. He lapped at the broth with obvious gratitude, his powerful tongue surprisingly gentle as it worked around her fingers. When the bowl was empty, he looked at her with an expression that seemed to convey thanks as clearly as human speech. During the morning hours, as Vera went about her routine tasks of maintaining the trading post, she found herself constantly returning to check on her unexpected patient. Each visit revealed new signs of recovery and new details that deepened her fascination with the animal she was nursing back to health. The wolf seemed to track her movements even when she was outside his field of vision, his head turning to follow the sound of her footsteps across the wooden floors of the trading post. More intriguingly, he showed no signs of the aggressive territoriality that she would have expected from a wild predator. When she entered the barn, he would lift, his head in greeting rather than bare his teeth in warning. When she worked around him, cleaning his wound, refreshing his water, adjusting his bedding, he remained completely relaxed, as if her presence brought him comfort rather than stress. His behavior suggested a level of socialization that went far beyond what any wild animal should possess. The mystery deepened when Vera discovered that the wolf responded to spoken commands. When she said stay, while cleaning his wound, he remained perfectly still despite what must have been considerable discomfort. When she told him to rest, he would lower his head and close his eyes with the obedience of a well-trained dog. Most remarkably, when she called him boy, in the gentle tone she might use with a beloved pet, his tail would move in what could only be described as a tentative wag. By midday, word of Vera's unusual patient had begun to spread among the few neighboring settlements that dotted the canyon passes. Jake Morrison, who ran a small mining operation 5 miles up the trail, stopped by to trade for supplies and stayed to examine the wolf with the expertise of a man who had spent 20 years hunting and trapping in the Sierra Nevada mountains. "That's no ordinary wolf, Miss Sinclair," Jake announced, after studying the animal from a respectful distance. "Look at the size of him, the muscle development, the way he carries himself even when he's injured. And those scars, someone's been working with this animal for years, training him, maybe even using him for hunting or tracking." Jake's weathered face was thoughtful as he considered the implications of what he was seeing. "You think he belongs to someone?" Vera asked, though part of her hoped the answer would be no. In the short time since discovering the wounded wolf, she had developed a protective attachment that surprised her with its intensity. "More than belongs to someone," Jake replied grimly. "An animal like this doesn't just wander away from its pack or its territory without good reason. Someone either lost him or sent him away deliberately, and given that bullet wound, I'd say someone wanted him gone permanently." The old prospector's expression darkened as he spoke, suggesting implications that made Vera's blood run cold. Jake's prediction proved accurate sooner than either of them had anticipated. That same afternoon, 3 riders approached the trading post from the direction of the higher mountain passes, men whose appearance and bearing immediately marked them as trouble of the most dangerous variety. Vera recognized the type from her years of dealing with the human predators who haunted the frontier: cold eyes, careful movements, and weapons worn with the casual familiarity of men who had killed before and expected to kill again. The leader was a tall, lean man with prematurely grey hair and a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, evidence of some long-ago encounter with violence that had left its permanent mark. His companions were cut from the same cloth, hard men with faces that revealed nothing of their thoughts or intentions. All 3 wore the kind of trail gear that suggested they had been traveling for days through difficult terrain, and their horses showed signs of being ridden hard and fast. "Afternoon, ma'am," the scarred man called out as he dismounted near Vera's porch. His voice was polite enough, but his eyes were already scanning the area around the trading post with the systematic attention of someone looking for something specific. "Name's Clayton Reeves. We're tracking a dangerous animal that came through this area last night. Wounded wolf, probably bleeding pretty heavily. You seen anything like that around here?" Vera's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle that stood propped beside her door, a movement that didn't go unnoticed by any of the 3 men. "Can't say that I have," she replied carefully. "What makes you think this wolf came through? Devil's Canyon Pass seems like a strange route for a wounded animal to choose." "This particular wolf ain't like most animals," Reeves answered, his scarred face splitting into a smile that held no warmth. "He's been trained to follow specific trails, to seek out certain kinds of places when he's in trouble. Trading, posts, way stations, anywhere he might find help from humans." The man's pale eyes were fixed on Vera's face, studying her reaction with the attention of someone accustomed to reading lies in other people's expressions. From inside the barn came a sound that made Vera's heart skip a beat. A low growl that was clearly audible despite the thick wooden walls that separated the wolf from the 3 strangers. The men's heads turned immediately toward the source of the sound, and Vera saw something like satisfaction flicker across Reeves's scarred features. "That wouldn't be him, would it?" Reeves asked, his hand moving to rest on the grip of his holstered pistol. "The wolf we're tracking is extremely valuable property, ma'am. Took us the better part of 2 years to train him properly, and we've got considerable investment in his recovery." The man's tone remained conversational, but there was an undercurrent of menace that made the hair on the back of Vera's neck stand on end. "I'm caring for an injured animal," Vera admitted, recognizing that denial would be pointless given. The wolf's vocal reaction to the presence of the strangers found him bleeding near my water trough this morning. Seemed like the Christian thing to do, helping a creature that was suffering. She kept her voice steady, despite the fear that was building in her chest, her years of dealing with dangerous men helping her maintain an outward appearance of calm. "Christian thing," Reeves repeated, his scarred smile growing wider. "That's real admirable, ma'am, but that animal represents a significant financial investment, and we can't afford to lose him to misguided charity. We'll be taking him off your hands now, save you the trouble of nursing him back to health." The man's companions had spread out slightly, their positions suggesting they were prepared for the possibility that Vera might resist their demands. "The animal is badly injured," Vera replied firmly. "Moving him now could kill him. If he truly belongs to you, then surely you'd want to ensure his recovery before subjecting him to the stress of travel." Even as she spoke, Vera was calculating distances and angles, trying to determine whether she could reach her rifle before the 3 men could draw their weapons. Reeves' expression hardened, and Vera realized that her attempt at reasonable negotiation had failed. "Ma'am, I'm going to say this once more, and I strongly advise you to listen carefully. That wolf in your barn is stolen property, and we're here to reclaim him. You can step aside and let us do what we came here to do, or you can try to interfere and face the consequences of that choice." The sound that emerged from the barn at that moment was unlike anything Vera had ever heard, a howl that seemed to contain fury, grief, and warning in equal measure. It was the voice of a creature that recognized mortal enemies and was preparing to fight despite his injuries. The 3 men's horses shied nervously at the sound, and even Reeves took an involuntary step backward. "That's no ordinary wolf," one of Reeves' companions muttered, his hand now openly resting on his gun. "Listen. To that sound, it's like he knows we're here, knows what we want." There was unease in the man's voice, as if the wolf's howl had touched some primitive fear that civilized men preferred to keep buried. Vera realized that whatever happened next would determine not only the wolf's fate, but quite possibly her own. The 3 men facing her were clearly prepared to use violence to reclaim what they considered their property, and her isolated trading post offered no possibility of help from neighbors or law enforcement. She was alone with her conscience, her courage, and a wounded wolf whose amber eyes had somehow convinced her that some things were worth fighting for. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, 3 dangerous men against 1 determined woman, with the fate of a magnificent predator hanging in the balance. In the barn, the wolf had fallen silent, but Vera could sense his presence like a living flame, wounded but not broken, waiting to see whether the human who had shown him kindness would prove worthy of the trust he had placed in her hands. The tension shattered like glass when Vera's hand finally closed around her Winchester rifle. Clayton Reeves' scarred face twisted into something ugly as his own weapon cleared leather, but before either could fire, the barn door exploded outward in a shower of splinters and torn hinges. The wounded wolf burst through the wreckage like a silver thunderbolt, his powerful frame somehow finding strength that should have been impossible given his injuries. What happened next defied everything Vera thought she knew about wild animals and their limitations. The wolf didn't attack the three men directly. Instead, he positioned himself between them and Vera, his massive frame radiating menace despite the dark stain of blood spreading across his shoulder bandages. His lips peeled back to reveal teeth like ivory daggers, and the sound that emerged from his throat was pure predatory promise, death to anyone who threatened the woman who had shown him kindness. Reeves's horse reared backward, nearly throwing its rider as the animal's instinct screamed warnings about the apex predator now facing them. The other two men's mounts sidled nervously, their eyes rolling white with terror that seemed to penetrate their very bones. Only years of hard living and violence kept the three men from following their horse's example and fleeing outright from the magnificent creature that stood guard over Vera Sinclair. "Easy there, Kodiak," Reeves called out, his voice carrying a strange mixture of authority and wariness. "Remember your training, boy. Remember who feeds you, who taught you everything you know." The name struck Vera like a physical blow. Kodiak. This magnificent predator had a name, a history, a connection to these dangerous men that went far, deeper than simple ownership. The wolf's response was immediate and devastating. Instead of the obedience Reeves clearly expected, Kodiak's growl deepened into something that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. His amber eyes never left the scarred man's face, and in that gaze, Vera saw something that made her blood run cold. Pure, intelligent hatred. This was no longer a trained animal responding to its master. This was a creature that had chosen its allegiance, and that choice did not include the men who claimed to own him. "Son of a bitch has turned wild," one of Reeves's companions muttered, his hand trembling slightly as he tried to keep his pistol trained on a target that radiated deadly intent. "Look at his eyes, Clayton. He ain't the same animal we've been working with. Something's changed in him." The fear in the man's voice was palpable, the kind of primal terror that civilized humans rarely experienced in their daily lives. Reeves's scarred face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan, and Vera realized that whatever control he had once exercised over this magnificent predator was now completely severed. The wolf, Kodiak, had made a choice that transcended training, ownership, and years of human manipulation. He had chosen to protect the woman who had shown him compassion in his moment of greatest vulnerability. "You don't understand what you're dealing with here, lady," Reeves said, his weapon still trained on Kodiak, but his voice carrying a note of desperate explanation. "That ain't just any wolf. He's been trained since he was a pup to track, to hunt, to kill on command. We've used him to find men who thought they could disappear into these mountains and never be seen again." The scarred man's words painted a picture that made Vera's stomach clench with horror. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Kodiak wasn't just a trained animal. He was a living weapon, raised and conditioned to hunt human prey through the most difficult terrain in the American West. The scars she had discovered during her examination suddenly took on new and terrible meaning. The rope burns around his neck weren't from training exercises, they were from struggling against restraints when his conscience warred with his conditioning. The knife wounds weren't from territorial disputes with other predators, they were from desperate men, fighting for their lives against an enemy unlike anything they had ever faced. "How many?" Vera asked quietly, her rifle now pointed directly at Reeves's chest. "How many men died because of what you turned him into?" The question hung in the air between them, like smoke from a funeral pyre, heavy with the weight of lives lost to human greed and cruelty. "Enough to make us rich," Reeves replied, with a cold smile that revealed nothing of conscience or regret. Bounty hunters, federal marshals, wanted men with prices on their heads. Kodiak could track any of them through terrain that would kill a normal hunting dog. He never failed us, never let a target escape once we put him on their trail. The man's voice carried a note of pride that made Vera's skin crawl with revulsion. But Kodiak's reaction to hearing his past described in such callous terms was immediate and profound. The great wolf's entire body began to tremble, not with fear or weakness, but with what could only be described as grief. His amber eyes, still fixed on Reeves, seemed to hold the weight of every life he had been forced to help end, every desperate soul he had tracked through the wilderness to their doom. The sound that emerged from his throat was no longer a growl, it was a keen of mourning, the voice of a creature that had been forced to betray his own noble nature. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Vera felt something break inside her chest as she witnessed the wolf's anguish. This magnificent predator hadn't been born a killer. He had been made into one by men who saw him as nothing more than a tool for their violent trade. The intelligence she had recognized in his amber eyes wasn't just natural cunning. It was the awareness of a creature that understood the moral weight of the acts he had been compelled to perform. "He remembers them," she whispered, understanding flooding through her like cold water. "Every man he helped you hunt down. He remembers. All of them." The realization transformed her view of Kodiak's injuries. That bullet wound wasn't just the result of human cruelty. It was an escape attempt, a desperate bid for freedom from a life that had become unbearable. "Course he remembers," Reeves sneered, though his scarred face showed signs of unease at the wolf's obvious distress. "Smart as any human, maybe smarter. That's what made him so valuable. He could think like his prey, anticipate their moves, understand their desperation. The man's words were meant to demonstrate Kodiak's worth as property, but they only served to highlight the tragedy of an intelligent creature forced into a role that violated everything noble about his nature. "What happened?" Vera demanded, her rifle never wavering from its target. "Why is he here? Why is he wounded? What made you lose control of your valuable weapon?" The questions came in a rush, driven by a need to understand how this magnificent creature had come to seek sanctuary at her isolated trading post. Reeves's expression darkened, and for the first time since his arrival, genuine anger replaced his calculated menace. "We were tracking a half-breed scout named Nahuel Stormwalker. Son of a bitch had been causing problems for some of our clients, helping wanted men disappear into Modoc territory where white law couldn't follow. Big money was riding on bringing him in, dead or alive." The scarred man's voice carried the bitterness of a professional who had been thwarted by unexpected circumstances. The name hit Vera like a physical blow, though she couldn't explain why. Nahuel Stormwalker. The syllables seemed to resonate in her mind, as if she had heard them before in dreams or half-remembered stories. Beside her, Kodiak's reaction was even more dramatic. The great wolf's head snapped up, his ears pricking forward with an intensity that suggested the name carried profound meaning for him as well. Stormwalker had been moving through the country for 3 days, staying ahead of us but not by much. Kodiak was tracking him perfectly, following a scent trail that should have led us right to our target. Reeves's scarred face twisted with frustration as he recounted the events, but something went wrong when we finally caught up. Instead of cornering our prey like he'd been trained to do, Kodiak just stopped, stood there in a clearing, looking at Stormwalker like he'd seen a ghost. The implications of Reeves's story were staggering. Kodiak had been trained to track and corner human prey with ruthless efficiency, but something about Nahuel Stormwalker had broken through years of conditioning and triggered a response that defied his programming. The wolf had recognized something in the Modoc warrior that transcended the simple predator-prey relationship he had been forced to accept. "Then what happened?" Vera pressed, though part of her already suspected the answer from the bullet wound in Kodiak's shoulder and the grief that seemed to radiate from his powerful frame. "The damn animal just laid down," Reeves spat. his anger at the memory overriding his caution, laid down in front of Stormwalker like he was surrendering, like he was asking for something. The half-breed started talking to him in that savage language, and I swear the wolf understood every word. When I ordered Kodiak to attack, he turned on us instead. The man's voice carried disbelief even now, as if he still couldn't accept what he had witnessed. "So you shot him," Vera stated flatly, the pieces of the story falling into place like the elements of a tragic puzzle. "Your own trained animal, worth years of work and considerable money. You shot him because he chose conscience over conditioning." The accusation hung between them like a sword, sharp with moral judgment that cut deeper than any physical weapon. "Damn right I shot him," Reeves snarled, his facade of control finally cracking to reveal the rage beneath. "No animal betrays. Me and lives to tell about it. Would have finished the job too if Stormwalker hadn't interfered. Son of a bitch started shooting at us, drove us back long enough for the wolf to disappear into the timber." The man's scarred face was flushed with fury, the humiliation of being bested by his own weapon still burning in his pale eyes. As Reeves finished his account, Vera found herself looking at Kodiak with new understanding and profound respect. This magnificent predator had endured years of training, designed to suppress his natural instincts and transform him into a tool for human violence. But when confronted with Nahuel Stormwalker, a man whose identity seemed to trigger some deep recognition, Kodiak had chosen to reclaim his own moral agency, even at the cost of a bullet wound and exile from the only life he had known. The wolf's amber eyes met hers, and in that gaze, Vera saw something that took her breath away. This wasn't just an animal seeking shelter and medical care. This was an intelligent being that had made a conscious choice to reject the role that had been forced upon him, and he had somehow recognized in her a kindred spirit, someone else who understood the weight of moral decisions made in isolation. "And danger, he's not going back with you," Vera said quietly, her words carrying the finality of absolute decision. "I don't care what he cost you to train. I don't care what profits you've lost. He's chosen a different path, and I'm going to honor that choice." The rifle in her hands remained steady, its barrel never wavering from Reeves' chest. "Lady, you're making a mistake that's going to cost you more than you can afford," Reeves warned, though his voice carried less certainty than before. The presence of the wolf, alert, protective, and clearly committed to defending Vera, had changed the dynamics of the confrontation in ways that made violence a far riskier proposition for the three men. "Maybe," Vera acknowledged, "but some mistakes are worth making. This is one of them." She could feel Kodiak's massive presence beside her like a living flame, his breath warm against her leg as he maintained his protective stance between her and the men who had once controlled. His life, the standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, three dangerous men facing a determined woman and a wolf who had chosen freedom over security. In the distance, storm clouds were building over the high peaks of the Sierra Nevada, promising weather that would make travel through the mountain passes treacherous for anyone unprepared for the challenges of wilderness survival. Reeves seemed to recognize that the situation had moved beyond his ability to control through intimidation alone. His scarred face showed the calculations of a man weighing the costs of violence against the likelihood of success, and finding the mathematics less favorable than he had hoped. The wolf's presence had introduced variables that made simple solutions impossible. "This ain't over," Reeves finally said, holstering his weapon with movements that suggested retreat rather than surrender. "That animal represents too much investment to write off because of one woman's misguided sympathy. We'll be back with more men, better preparation. You can't guard him forever." The threat was delivered with the cold certainty of a man who had never been permanently thwarted by obstacles, As the three men mounted their horses and prepared to leave, Kodiak maintained his protective stance until their dust had disappeared beyond the bend in the canyon trail. Only then did he allow himself to show the toll that his dramatic intervention had taken on his wounded body. His powerful legs trembled with exhaustion, and the bandages around his shoulder had turned crimson with fresh blood from his exertions. Vera immediately knelt beside him, her hands gentle as she examined the damage his heroic defense had caused to his healing wound. "You magnificent, foolish creature," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion she hadn't expected to feel. "You could have reopened everything, could have bled to death defending someone you barely know." But even as she spoke the words of reproach, her touch conveyed only gratitude and growing affection. Kodiak's response was to press his massive head against her shoulder, a gesture that seemed to convey both exhaustion and contentment. For the first time since his arrival, he seemed truly at peace, not the uneasy rest of a wounded animal, but the deep relaxation of a creature that had finally found where it belonged. His amber eyes closed, and the sound that emerged from his throat was the rumbling purr of complete trust. As Vera helped him back to the barn and his bed of fresh hay, she realized that everything had changed in the space of a few dramatic minutes. She was no longer simply caring for an injured animal. She was harboring a fugitive, protecting a being that had chosen moral courage over comfortable servitude. The decision would bring danger, uncertainty, and challenges she couldn't yet imagine. But as she looked into Kodiak's amber eyes, she knew she would make the same choice again without hesitation. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the western peaks when Vera settled beside Kodiak's makeshift bed, her rifle across her knees, and her mind already working on the practical problems of defending an isolated trading post against determined enemies. But for now, in the golden light filtering through the barn's wooden walls, there was peace, a woman and a wolf who had both chosen conscience over convenience, preparing to face whatever consequences their moral courage might bring. 3 nights after Clayton Reeves and his men disappeared into the mountain wilderness, Vera began experiencing dreams unlike anything she had ever known. They came not as the fragmented images of normal sleep, but as vivid visions that seemed to transport her consciousness across vast distances and through barriers of time itself. In these nocturnal journeys, she found herself standing in places she had never visited, ancient forests where massive pines reached towards star-filled skies, and sacred clearings where the very air seemed to pulse with spiritual energy. The dreams always featured the same mysterious figure, a tall man with bronze skin and long black hair adorned with eagle feathers and carved bone ornaments. His face bore the strong features of Modoc ancestry, but his eyes held depths that seemed to encompass generations of wisdom and sorrow. He moved through her visions with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness, his every gesture speaking of a profound connection to the natural world that surrounded him. Most remarkably, this dream figure was always accompanied by wolves, not just one, but entire packs that followed him with the devotion typically reserved for alpha members of their own species. The wolves in her visions were magnificent specimens, their coats ranging from pure white to deep gray, their eyes reflecting intelligence that seemed almost human in its complexity. But among all these powerful predators, one stood out with startling familiarity. Kodiak, the same silver coat, the same amber eyes, the same regal bearing that had first captured Vera's attention beside her water trough. But in the dreams, this wolf appeared younger, healthier, unmarked by the scars of forced servitude and human cruelty. He moved alongside the mysterious warrior with perfect synchronization, their partnership speaking of bonds forged through mutual respect rather than dominance and submission. The dreams began to reveal fragments of story, like pieces of an ancient puzzle slowly assembling themselves in Vera's sleeping mind. She witnessed scenes of the warrior and his wolf companion traveling through territories that seemed to exist beyond the reach of white civilization, places where the old ways still held sway, where humans and animals maintained relationships based on spiritual kinship rather than ownership. She saw rituals performed under moonlight, ceremonies that celebrated the sacred connection between human and wolf consciousness. But the visions also contained elements of tragedy that made Vera wake with tears on her cheeks. She witnessed the warrior's death, not in battle, but surrounded by his wolf pack in a hidden valley where wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion. The man's passing seemed to be part of some natural cycle, accepted by both wolves and forest with the serenity of beings who understood that death was merely another form of transformation. Most disturbing were the final moments of these recurring dreams. As the warrior's spirit departed his physical form, Kodiak would throw back his magnificent head and release a howl that seemed to contain all the grief and loss that the natural world had ever experienced. The sound would echo across the dream landscape like a lament for innocence lost, for connections severed, for the sacred bonds between human and animal that were being systematically destroyed by the advancing tide of civilization. During the days that followed these vivid dreams, Vera began to notice profound changes in Kodiak's behavior and condition. His physical recovery was proceeding at a rate that seemed to defy medical explanation. The bullet wound that should have taken weeks to heal was closing with remarkable speed, leaving behind only a thin line of scar tissue that barely disrupted. The silver perfection of his coat, his strength was returning in dramatic increments, his powerful frame regaining the muscle tone that spoke of a predator in his absolute prime. But the changes went far beyond physical healing. Kodiak began exhibiting behaviors that suggested he was remembering aspects of his nature that had been suppressed during his years of forced servitude. He would stand for hours at the edge of Vera's property, his amber eyes fixed on the high mountain passes as if he were listening for sounds that human ears could not detect. Sometimes he would tilt his magnificent head and release soft calls that seemed designed to carry across vast distances. Not the howls of a solitary animal, but the complex vocalizations used by wolves to communicate with distant pack members. Most remarkably, Kodiak began demonstrating abilities that seemed to transcend normal animal capabilities. He would alert Vera to approaching travelers long before they came within visual range, his behavior suggesting he could somehow sense human presence across distances that should have been impossible. When supply wagons approached the trading post, he could distinguish between friendly merchants and potentially dangerous strangers with an accuracy that seemed almost supernatural. The wolf also began showing an uncanny ability to predict weather changes that caught even experienced mountain dwellers by surprise. Hours before storm fronts moved through the canyon passes, Kodiak would become restless and insistent, herding Vera toward the safety of her reinforced cellar with behavior that brooked no argument. On 3 separate occasions, his warnings proved accurate, as sudden tempests swept through Devil's Canyon Pass with violence that would have been deadly to anyone caught in the open. Perhaps most unsettling was Kodiak's reaction to certain objects that Vera discovered while cleaning out her late father's personal effects. When she opened a cedar chest that had remained sealed since her father's death, the wolf became intensely agitated, his entire body trembling with what appeared to be recognition. Among the items in the chest was a collection of Native American artifacts, arrowheads, carved bone tools, and a magnificent war bonnet that seemed to pulse with spiritual energy in the lamplight. Kodiak's response to these objects was immediate and profound. He approached the war bonnet with the reverence typically shown by devout believers entering a sacred space, his head lowered and his movements slow and deliberate. When Vera lifted the headdress to examine its intricate beadwork and feather arrangements, the wolf released a sound that was part whimper, part keen. The voice of a creature recognizing something precious that had been lost, and unexpectedly. "Found, these belonged to someone you knew, didn't they?" Vera whispered, her fingers tracing the elaborate patterns worked into the war bonnet's leather crown. "Someone important, someone you loved." Kodiak's amber eyes met hers with an intensity that seemed to confirm her speculation, and for a moment she could have sworn she saw human tears glistening in those depths. Word of Vera's unusual companion had begun to spread throughout the scattered settlements of the Sierra Nevada, carried by traders and travelers who stopped at her post for supplies and rest. The stories grew more elaborate with each telling, tales of a woman living alone with a wolf larger than any natural predator, an animal that displayed intelligence and loyalty that seemed almost supernatural. Some accounts described the wolf as a guardian spirit, others as a dangerous beast held in check only by dark magic. The growing reputation of the Wolf Woman of Devil's Canyon Pass attracted visitors that Vera would have preferred to avoid. Circuit preachers arrived to warn her about consorting with creatures of darkness, their biblical quotations mixing uneasily with frontier superstitions about shapeshifters and demon familiars. Federal marshals stopped by to investigate reports of dangerous animals threatening travelers, their official questions barely concealing curiosity about rumors of a wolf trained to hunt human prey. Most troubling were the visits from professional hunters and trappers drawn by stories of a specimen that would command extraordinary prices from wealthy collectors in San Francisco and Denver. These hard-eyed men studied Kodiak with the calculating gaze of individuals who saw only profit in his magnificent form, their conversations filled with discussions of capture techniques and market values that made Vera's blood run cold with protective fury. The pressure from unwanted attention was beginning to affect both Vera and Kodiak in ways that concerned her deeply. The wolf had become increasingly protective of their shared territory, his tolerance for strangers dropping to levels that bordered on dangerous hostility. When visitors approached the trading post, Kodiak would position himself between them, and Vera with body language that left no doubt about his willingness to use violence if necessary. His amber eyes would track every movement with predatory intensity, and the low rumble that emerged from his throat carried promises of swift and brutal retaliation against anyone who threatened his chosen human. Vera found herself caught between her natural inclination toward hospitality and her growing need to protect both Kodiak and herself from people whose intentions were becoming increasingly questionable. She began limiting her hours of operation, turning away visitors who arrived after dark, or who seemed more interested in examining her wolf than conducting legitimate business. The isolation that had once been merely lonely was now becoming oppressive, weighted with the constant awareness that danger could arrive at any moment. The situation reached a crisis point when a group of investors from Sacramento arrived, with an offer to purchase Kodiak for what they described as scientific study. The three well-dressed men produced official-looking documents and spoke in cultured tones about the advancement of natural philosophy. But their eyes held the same calculating coldness that Vera had learned to associate with men who viewed living creatures as commodities to be exploited. "Miss Sinclair, you must understand that an animal of this caliber represents an unprecedented opportunity for scientific advancement," the lead investor explained, his manicured hands gesturing toward Kodiak with the casual authority of someone accustomed to purchasing whatever caught his fancy. "The anatomical studies alone could revolutionize our understanding of lupine intelligence and behavior. The compensation we're prepared to offer would allow you to relocate anywhere you choose, perhaps to a more civilized environment where a woman of your obvious capabilities could thrive." Kodiak's reaction to these visitors was immediate and unmistakable. The great wolf rose from his position beside Vera's chair and stalked toward the three men with movements that spoke of barely controlled violence. His lips peeled back to reveal teeth like ivory daggers, and the sound that emerged from his throat was the voice of death incarnate, a promise that anyone who attempted to separate him from Vera would pay the ultimate price for their presumption. On the seventh night after the investor's departure, Vera was awakened not by dreams, but by Kodiak's behavior. The wolf had abandoned his usual sleeping position beside her bed and was standing at the cabin's main window, his entire body rigid with attention, focused on something moving in the darkness beyond her property. His ears were pricked forward with laser-like intensity, and his tail held the elevated position that indicated extreme alertness rather than aggression. Vera joined him at the window, peering out into the moonlit landscape of the canyon pass. At first she saw nothing unusual, just the familiar silhouettes of rocks and scrub pine painted silver by the overhead moon. But as her eyes adjusted to the night vision, she began to detect movement that didn't match the random patterns of wind-blown vegetation. Something was approaching through the darkness, moving with the fluid stealth of a predator stalking prey. But Kodiak's reaction suggested that whatever was out there represented something other than a threat. Instead of the low growl he typically used to warn of danger, the wolf was making soft whimpering sounds that spoke of recognition, longing, and profound emotional complexity. His amber eyes reflected the moonlight like twin flames, and his powerful body trembled with what appeared to be anticipation rather than fear. The figure that finally emerged from the shadows defied every expectation that Vera's frontier experience had prepared her to handle. The man who stepped into the circle of moonlight surrounding her trading post was the same individual who had haunted her dreams for the past week, tall, bronze-skinned, moving with the fluid grace of someone who belonged to the wilderness rather than merely passing through it. Eagle feathers adorned his long black hair, and his clothing combined traditional Modoc elements with practical frontier modifications that spoke of a man existing between two worlds. Most remarkably, he was not alone. Moving beside him with perfect synchronization was another wolf. This one pure white with eyes like blue ice, a magnificent female whose bearing suggested she was every bit as exceptional as Kodiak himself. The two animals regarded each other across the distance, separating them, with recognition that seemed to transcend simple species identification. Nahuel Stormwalker, for this could be no one else, raised one hand in a gesture that was part greeting, part blessing, and spoke in a voice that carried easily across the night air, despite its conversational tone. "Vera Sinclair," he said, his words carrying an accent that spoke of English learned as a second language but mastered with careful precision. "I have come to speak with you about the wolf you are protecting. His name in my people's tongue is Dakota's friend to all, but I believe you know him by another name." The sound of Kodiak's original name seemed to break something loose inside the great wolf's chest. He threw back his magnificent head and released a howl that seemed to contain all the longing, grief, and joy that a living creature could experience. The sound echoed across the canyon walls and returned as a chorus, as if the very mountains were acknowledging the significance of this moment. When the echoes finally faded, Kodiak looked at Vera with eyes that seemed to be asking permission for something that would change both their lives forever. Nahuel Stormwalker approached with movements that suggested he understood exactly how dangerous this moment could become. His hands remained visible and empty, his posture conveying respect rather than challenge, his eyes fixed on Vera rather than the wolf whose loyalty he was about to test. When he reached the edge of her porch, he stopped and waited, not with the impatience of a man accustomed to immediate compliance, but with the infinite patience of someone who understood that some reunions could not be rushed. Dakota was my father's companion, Nahuel said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of stories that stretched back through generations of Modoc tradition. They hunted together, traveled together, faced danger together for more than 15 years. When my father died in the sacred valley where our ancestors rest, Lakota disappeared. We searched for him throughout the winter, but found no trace. I believed he had chosen to join my father in the spirit world. The explanation hit Vera like a physical blow, suddenly making sense of everything she had witnessed. Kodiak's scars, his trained behavior, his profound intelligence, and most importantly, his choice to rebel against Clayton Reeves when faced with hunting down Nahuel Stormwalker. The wolf hadn't been betraying his human masters. He had been recognizing the son of the man who had truly earned his love and loyalty. Kodiak took a step toward Nahuel, then stopped and looked back at Vera with an expression that seemed to hold the weight of an impossible choice. In his amber eyes, she could see the conflict between old loyalties and new bonds, between the memory of a beloved companion and gratitude toward the woman who had shown him kindness in his darkest hour. He was asking her to understand something that no words could convey, that love didn't have to mean abandonment, that choosing one path didn't require betraying another. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Vera knelt beside the great wolf and placed her hand on his powerful shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palm. "Go," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion she hadn't expected to feel. "Go to him. He's been searching for you, and you've been searching for him. Some bonds are too sacred to keep separated by human interference." As she spoke, she felt something break and heal simultaneously in her chest, the pain of letting go, balanced by the joy of witnessing love triumph over circumstance. But Kodiak's response surprised them all. Instead of immediately going to Nahuel, the wolf moved to position himself between them, his magnificent head turning from one to the other as if he were trying to solve a problem that required wisdom beyond normal animal understanding. When he finally moved, it was to walk to Nahuel and touch the warrior's outstretched hand with his muzzle, a gesture of recognition and respect. Then he returned to Vera's side and pressed his head against her shoulder, a gesture of gratitude and continued loyalty. The message was clear. His heart was large enough for both connections, and he refused to choose between them. Nahuel Stormwalker settled cross-legged on Vera's porch with the easy grace of a man equally comfortable in council lodges and wilderness. On camps, his white wolf companion, who he introduced as Ayana, meaning eternal blossom, positioned herself beside Lakota with the natural synchronization of pack members who had been separated and were now complete once again. The two magnificent predators touched noses in greeting, their behavior speaking of bonds that transcended the human understanding of animal relationships. "My father was not born Modoc," Nahuel began, his voice carrying the cadence of someone accustomed to preserving important stories through oral tradition. "He was taken by our people as a child during a raid on a wagon train, raised by my grandmother after his birth family was lost to disease and violence. But the spirits gave him a gift that transcended the boundaries between white and native worlds. He could speak with wolves as easily as he spoke with humans." As Nahuel spoke, Vera found herself drawn into a narrative that challenged everything she thought she understood about the relationship between civilization and wilderness. The warrior's father, known among the Modoc as Mateo Rainsong, had become a bridge between two incompatible ways of life, using his unique abilities to protect both his adopted people and the increasing numbers of settlers who were pushing into traditional tribal territories. "Lakota was not the first wolf to choose my father as a companion," Nahuel continued, his weathered hand moving to rest on the white wolf's head with unconscious affection. "But he was the most remarkable. They found each other when both were young. My father barely 20 summers, Dakota still carrying the awkwardness of a wolf not yet grown into his full strength. Their partnership lasted 15 years, through battles and hunts, through seasons of plenty and winters when survival itself was uncertain. The story that unfolded painted a picture of a man who had used his extraordinary gift to prevent conflicts rather than cause them. Mateo Rainsong had served as a mediator between Modoc bands and white settlers, his wolf companions providing evidence of his spiritual authority that both cultures could respect. Dakota had been trained not as a weapon for hunting humans, but as a guardian whose presence could prevent violence through the simple demonstration of what was possible when different species chose cooperation over conflict. But the most remarkable aspect of Mateo's work had been his establishment of what he called sanctuary trails, hidden routes through the mountains that allowed desperate people from both cultures to find safety when caught between competing loyalties. Runaway slaves fleeing north to freedom, Modoc families escaping military campaigns, settlers whose consciences could no longer tolerate the violence being committed in the name of progress. All had found refuge through paths that Mateo and his wolves had carved through seemingly impassable terrain. My father believed that the spirits had given him his gift for a specific purpose, Nahuel explained, his dark eyes reflecting memories that seemed to stretch back through generations. He said that someday the old ways and new ways would have to find common ground, or both would be destroyed by their inability to coexist. Dakota was meant to be proof that such cooperation was possible. A wild predator who chose to serve something greater than his own survival. Vera felt her stomach clench with growing horror as Nahuel's narrative took a darker turn. The story of how Dakota had fallen into the hands of Clayton Reeves and his associates was a tale of betrayal that struck at the very heart of everything the wolf and his original companion had represented. It began with the death of Mateo Rainsong, not from violence or disease, but from the gradual failure of a heart that had carried too much grief over the destruction of everything he had worked to preserve. When my father died, Dakota disappeared into the high country, Nahuel continued, his voice carrying the weight of personal loss that had never fully healed. We found his tracks leading toward the sacred valley where our ancestors rest, and we assumed he had chosen to join my father in the spirit world. But Dakota's grief had made him vulnerable to deception in ways that his training had never prepared him to recognize. The details of Dakota's capture were almost too painful for Vera to absorb. Reeves and his associates had studied Mateo, Rainsong's methods for months, learning enough about wolf behavior to set traps that exploited the animal's greatest strength, his loyalty to humans who showed him kindness. They had used a Confederate posing as an injured traveler to lure the grieving wolf close enough for capture, then subjected him to training methods that systematically corrupted everything noble about his nature. They broke him without destroying. His abilities, Nahuel said, his voice hard with controlled anger. They turned his gift for tracking humans from a tool of protection into a weapon of destruction. Every instinct my father had carefully nurtured toward cooperation and mercy, they twisted into habits of hunting and killing. It was a perversion of everything sacred about the bond between human and wolf. The transformation hadn't happened quickly or easily. Dakota had resisted his new conditioning with desperate determination, refusing food, attempting escape, and showing aggression toward his captors that had nearly resulted in his death on several occasions. But Reeves and his men had been patient, using techniques that combined starvation, isolation, and carefully applied rewards to gradually reshape the wolf's behavioral patterns until cooperation became a matter of survival rather than choice. Most cruelly, They had forced Lakota to participate in the hunting of men who reminded him of his original companion, Native Americans fleeing military campaigns, mixed-blood individuals caught between two worlds, anyone whose appearance or behavior triggered memories of the life he had lost. Each successful hunt had driven the knife of corruption deeper into his soul, until the magnificent predator who had once been a symbol of hope became a living embodiment of despair. The men Lakota helped them capture weren't criminals, Nahuel explained, his fists clenched with suppressed fury. They were people who had chosen conscience over comfort, individuals who were trying to protect others from the violence that was consuming our homeland. Some were my friends, my relatives, members of my own family. Lakota was forced to betray everything my father had taught him about honor and loyalty. Vera found herself looking at Lakota with new understanding of the profound trauma that lay beneath his remarkable intelligence and gentle behavior. The scars she had discovered during his recovery weren't just evidence of physical abuse. They were markers of a psychological torture designed to transform nobility into brutality. The fact that he had retained any capacity for love and trust was nothing short of miraculous. But the spirits work in ways that human understanding cannot fully grasp, Nahuel continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone approaching the climax of a sacred story. When Reeves sent Lakota to track me through the high country, neither of them understood that they were creating the conditions for the wolf's redemption rather than sealing his damnation. The moment Lakota saw me in that mountain clearing, he recognized not just my face, but my father's spirit living on through his bloodline. The scene that Nahuel described was one of the most emotionally powerful that Vera had ever heard recounted. The great wolf, conditioned for years to attack on command, had suddenly found himself face to face with the son of the man he had loved more than life itself. Instead of the mindless aggression his training demanded, Lakota had experienced a moment of spiritual awakening that shattered his conditioning like glass struck by lightning. He came to me not as a weapon, but as a penitent, Nahuel said, softly, his hand moving to rest on Lakota's magnificent head. He laid himself at my feet and keened like a mourning woman, crying out all the grief and shame that he had carried for 3 years of forced betrayal. I spoke to him in the old words, the ones my father had used when they worked together, and I saw recognition kindle in his eyes like a flame that had never truly been extinguished. The confrontation with Reeves and his men had been brief but decisive. When the scarred bounty hunter had ordered Lakota to attack, the wolf had instead turned on his captors with fury that seemed to channel all the rage of the natural world against those who would corrupt its sacred relationships. Reeves' bullet had found its mark, but not before Lakota had demonstrated that some bonds were too deep to be severed by human cruelty. I should have kept him with me, Nahuel admitted, his voice carrying the weight of regret. But Lakota was wounded in body and spirit, and he needed more healing than I could provide while dodging bounty hunters through the mountains. When he disappeared into the forest, I prayed to the spirits that he would find sanctuary with someone who could offer him the peace that his soul required. The revelation that followed struck Vera like a physical blow. Lakota hadn't found her trading post by accident. He had been guided there by spiritual forces that transcended human understanding. The dreams that had been visiting her sleep weren't random products of an overactive imagination, but messages from Mateo Rainsong's spirit, preparing her for the role she was meant to play in his beloved companion's redemption. "My father spoke to you through the dream world," Nahuel said, his dark eyes fixed on Vera's face with intensity that seemed to look directly into her soul. "He chose you as the instrument of Lakota's healing because he recognized in you the same qualities that had allowed their partnership to flourish: courage tempered by compassion, strength guided by wisdom, and a willingness to sacrifice personal safety for the welfare of others. As the moon reached its zenith above Devil's Canyon Pass, Nahuel rose and moved to a leather pouch that hung from his belt. From within its depths, he withdrew objects that seemed to pulse with spiritual energy in the silver light. Eagle, feathers bound with sinew, small stones carved with symbols that predated written language, and a handful of herbs that filled the night air with scents of sage and sweetgrass when he crushed them between his palms. "There is a ceremony," he explained, his voice taking on the formal tones of someone preparing to perform a sacred ritual. "Among my people, when a wolf chooses a human companion, both must be acknowledged by the spirits as worthy of the bond they seek to create. Lakota chose my father many years ago, and their partnership was blessed by rituals that made them spiritual. Brothers, as well as hunting companions." Vera felt her pulse quicken as she began to understand what Nahuel was suggesting. The ceremony he described wasn't just a symbolic acknowledgement of the relationship between human and wolf. It was a spiritual commitment that would bind her to Lakota with ties that transcended ordinary ownership or companionship. She would become his chosen human, just as surely as he had become her chosen guardian. "The ritual requires consent from all participants," Nahuel continued, his eyes moving between Vera and Lakota with careful attention to their reactions. "The wolf must choose freely, without coercion or conditioning. The human must accept the responsibilities that come with such a partnership, to protect, to honor, and to trust in ways that most people cannot understand. And the spirits must give their blessing to a bond that will last beyond death itself." Lakota's response was immediate and unmistakable. The great wolf rose and walked to where the ceremonial objects lay arranged on the wooden planks of the porch, then lay down with his head resting between his paws, the same position of reverent attention that Vera had seen him adopt when she had shown him her father's collection of Native American artifacts. His amber eyes never left her face, and in their depths she could see a question that needed no words to convey its meaning. Vera knelt beside the wolf and placed her hand on his powerful shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Beneath her palm, "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion that seemed to come from depths she hadn't known existed within her. "If you're willing to trust me with such a sacred responsibility, then I accept whatever that commitment requires." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Vera had experienced in her Christian upbringing, yet it felt more spiritually authentic than any church service she had ever attended. Nahuel began with prayers spoken in the Modoc language, his voice rising and falling with rhythms that seemed to match the natural sounds of wind through pine needles and water flowing over stones. As he spoke, he scattered the crushed herbs around them in patterns that created invisible boundaries between the sacred space of the ritual and the ordinary world beyond. Ayana, the white wolf, added her voice to the ceremony with sounds that were neither howls nor whimpers, but something that seemed to bridge the gap between animal communication and human speech. Lakota responded with similar vocalizations, creating a dialogue between the two magnificent predators that spoke of recognition, acceptance, and spiritual kinship that needed no translation. As the ceremony reached its climax, Nahuel placed one of the carved stones in Vera's palm and guided her hand to rest on Lakota's forehead just between his amber eyes. The moment their skin made contact, Vera felt a jolt of connection that seemed to bypass her physical senses entirely and strike directly at her consciousness. Suddenly, she could sense Lakota's thoughts and emotions with startling clarity. His gratitude for her kindness, his determination to protect her from any threat, and beneath everything else, a profound sense of peace that seemed to radiate from the very core of his being. The connection flowed both ways, and Vera realized That Dakota was experiencing her emotions with equal intensity, her fears about the dangers they would face together, her wonder at the spiritual forces that had brought them to this moment, her growing love for the magnificent creature who had chosen to trust her with his loyalty. All of it was shared between them in an instant of perfect understanding. When Nahuel finally indicated that the ritual was complete, Vera felt fundamentally changed in ways that she couldn't immediately articulate. The wolf beside her was no longer just an animal she was caring for. He was a spiritual partner whose well-being had become as important to her as her own survival. The responsibility was overwhelming, but so was the sense of completeness that came from knowing she would never again face the world's dangers alone. "The bond you have accepted will be tested," Nahuel warned, his expression serious despite the joy that had marked the ceremony's conclusion. "Reeves and his men will return, probably with reinforcements and better preparation. There will be others who seek to capture or kill Dakota for reasons ranging from profit to simple fear of what they cannot understand. Your commitment to protect him will require sacrifices that you cannot yet imagine." But even as Nahuel spoke these words of caution, Vera felt only confidence and determination flowing through the spiritual connection she now shared with Dakota. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the strength and wisdom of a creature whose loyalty had been tested by years of corruption and had emerged purified by suffering. Together, they represented something that transcended the boundaries between human and animal, civilized and wild, sacred and ordinary. As the first light of dawn began to touch the eastern peaks of the Sierra Nevada, Vera realized that her life at the isolated trading post would never again be defined by loneliness or uncertainty. She had become part of something larger than herself, connected to spiritual forces that would guide and protect her through whatever trials the future might bring. The wolf at her side was no longer just Dakota. He was the living embodiment of a sacred trust that would endure long after the conflicts of their present world had faded into memory. 2 days after the sacred ceremony that bound Vera to Dakota through spiritual ties deeper than blood, the first signs of approaching danger began to manifest in ways that tested the new connection between woman and wolf. Dakota's behavior shifted from the peaceful contentment that had followed the ritual to a state of hypervigilance that seemed to vibrate through every fiber of his magnificent frame. He would spend hours positioned at different vantage points around the trading post, his amber eyes scanning the canyon approaches with intensity that spoke of threats detected through senses that transcended normal animal capabilities. The spiritual bond they now shared allowed Vera to experience fragments of what Dakota was perceiving, and the sensations were deeply unsettling. Through their connection, she felt the presence of multiple human consciousnesses moving through the high country with purpose and malevolence that made her skin crawl with premonition. These weren't casual travelers or even ordinary bandits. They were organized, well-equipped, and focused on a specific objective that centered on her isolated trading post. Nahuel had remained at the post since the ceremony, his own warrior instincts confirming the danger that Dakota's enhanced senses were detecting. The Modoc warrior moved with the careful precision of a man who had spent years surviving in territory where a single mistake could prove fatal, his weapons always within reach, and his pale blue wolf companion maintaining constant surveillance of the surrounding terrain. Together, the 4 beings, 2 humans and 2 wolves, formed a defensive unit that combined frontier pragmatism with spiritual awareness. "They're not just coming for Dakota," Nahuel observed on the second morning, his dark eyes reflecting knowledge gained through methods that civilization would dismiss as superstition. The spiritual energies we invoked during the ceremony have created disturbances that can be felt by anyone sensitive to such forces. Clayton Reeves may not understand what he's detecting, but he knows that something fundamental has changed in the balance of power between hunter and prey. The truth of Nahuel's assessment became apparent when Jake Morrison arrived at the trading post just after sunrise, his weathered face grim with news that confirmed their worst fears. The old prospector had encountered a large group of armed men making camp in the valley below Devil's Canyon Pass, not the random collection of drifters and fortune-seekers who typically haunted the mountain trails, but a disciplined force that included federal marshals, professional bounty hunters, and what appeared to be military personnel operating without official sanction. 23 men, Jake reported, his voice tight with concern for Vera's safety. All of them armed to the teeth and organized like they're planning a siege rather than a simple capture operation. That scarred bastard Reeves is leading them, but he's got backing from people with serious resources and government connections. They're not just after your wolf anymore, Miss Sinclair. They're treating this like a threat to national security. The escalation from personal vendetta to federal intervention revealed the true scope of the forces arrayed against them. Through contacts in Sacramento and San Francisco, Reeves had convinced powerful interests that the spiritual partnership between Vera and Dakota represented a dangerous precedent, evidence that Native American mysticism could corrupt white settlers and potentially inspire broader resistance to the civilizing mission of westward expansion. What had begun as a simple attempt to reclaim valuable property had evolved into something approaching a holy war between competing worldviews. The attack commenced at dawn on the third day, but not in the direct assault that Vera had expected, from men accustomed to overwhelming opposition through superior firepower. Instead, Reeves demonstrated a tactical sophistication that spoke of military training and careful study of siege warfare principles. Rather than charging the trading post directly, his forces established positions that controlled every possible escape route while maintaining fields of fire that could devastate anyone attempting to break out of the encirclement. The psychological warfare began immediately. Using a brass-speaking trumpet that carried his voice clearly across the canyon, Reeves delivered ultimatums designed to erode the defenders' resolve through a combination of threats and false promises. He offered Vera safe passage to any destination of her choosing if she would surrender Dakota voluntarily, painted vivid pictures of the federal charges she would face if she continued to harbor what he termed a dangerous predator, and described the reinforcements that were allegedly en route to crush any resistance. But the most insidious aspect of the siege was Reeves' attempt to exploit the spiritual connection between Vera and Dakota for tactical advantage. Having observed enough of the wolf's behavior to recognize that his loyalty to Vera had transcended normal animal conditioning, the scarred bounty hunter began targeting her specifically with sniper fire designed to wound rather than kill. Each bullet that came close enough to draw blood sent waves of protective fury through Dakota that threatened to drive him into suicidal charges against impossible odds. He's trying to make Dakota's love for you into a weapon against both of you, Nahuel observed grimly, his own rifle trained on the rock outcropping where the sniper fire was originating. If he can wound you badly enough, Dakota will abandon all caution to reach your side. That's when they'll have clear shots at both of you. The Modoc warrior's tactical assessment was delivered with the calm precision of someone who had survived similar situations, but Vera could see the concern in his dark eyes. The siege evolved into a deadly game of patience and precision that tested every aspect of the defender's capabilities. Vera found herself drawing on skills her father had taught her during the years when Apache raids had threatened frontier settlements. How to conserve ammunition, how to calculate angles of fire, how to maintain defensive positions despite the psychological pressure of constant threat. But she also discovered new abilities that seemed to flow from her spiritual bond with Lakota. Through their mystical connection, she could sense the locations of enemy forces with accuracy that defied rational explanation. When snipers moved to new positions, she felt their presence as cold spots in her consciousness that allowed her to direct return fire with devastating precision. When assault teams prepared to rush the trading post from multiple directions, Lakota's awareness of their movements flooded through their shared bond in time for effective countermeasures to be prepared. The combination of frontier marksmanship, Native American stealth tactics, and supernatural awareness proved more effective than Reeves had anticipated. By midday of the first siege day, 3 of his men were dead and 5 more were wounded seriously, enough to require evacuation to the rear positions. The federal marshals who had joined the operation began questioning whether the capture of one wolf was worth casualties that would be difficult to explain in official reports. The turning point in the siege came not from military action, but from the arrival of an unexpected participant whose presence transformed the entire nature of the conflict. As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the western peaks, a lone rider approached the besieging forces under a flag of truce. A tall, elegantly dressed man whose expensive clothes and cultured bearing marked him as someone from the highest levels of territorial society. Governor Harrison Blackwood himself had come to personally oversee what he described as the elimination of a threat to the orderly development of California's natural resources. The territorial governor was a man whose political career had been built on promises to pacify the frontier and make it safe for industrial exploitation, and the existence of spiritual partnerships between settlers and Native American mysticism represented everything he had vowed to destroy. "Miss Sinclair," Blackwood called out through Reeves's speaking trumpet, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I am prepared to offer you full pardons for any federal crimes you may have committed, along with compensation sufficient to establish yourself comfortably in any civilized community of your choosing. All that is required is your cooperation in resolving this unfortunate situation peacefully." But the governor's definition of peaceful resolution proved to be far more sinister than simple surrender. Through the spiritual connection she shared with Lakota, Vera could sense the presence of other wolves in the surrounding forest. Members of Lakota's original pack, who had been captured and conditioned using the same brutal methods that had once corrupted her beloved companion. Blackwood had brought them as weapons, intending to force Lakota to watch as his former family members were destroyed if he refused to submit to recapture. The psychological torture implicit in Blackwood's strategy revealed the true depths of civilized cruelty that could be concealed beneath official rhetoric about law and order. The governor understood that Lakota's greatest strength, his capacity for love and loyalty, could be transformed into his greatest weakness if properly exploited. By threatening the wolves who shared his bloodline, Blackwood hoped to break the spiritual bond that had given the defenders their supernatural advantages. Nahuel's reaction to the governor's arrival was immediate and decisive. The Modoc warrior had recognized Blackwood's voice from previous encounters during treaty negotiations, and his knowledge of the man's character provided crucial intelligence about the true scope of their predicament. "He's not here to negotiate," Nahuel warned quietly. Blackwood seized this situation as an opportunity to demonstrate that white authority cannot be challenged by any combination of forces, no matter how spiritually powerful they might be. The revelation that followed struck Vera like a physical blow and explained much about how their enemies had been able to organize such a comprehensive siege in such a short time. Her own father's death 3 months earlier hadn't been the result of a random storm, as she had been led to believe. It had been orchestrated by Blackwood's agents as part of a systematic campaign to eliminate anyone whose presence on the frontier encouraged cooperation between white settlers and Native American communities. Thomas Sinclair was becoming too influential among the isolated settlers, Blackwood explained, with the casual indifference of a man discussing livestock management. His trading post served as a meeting ground where dangerous ideas about coexistence and mutual respect were spreading like a contagion. His death was necessary to prevent the formation of alliances that could have interfered with the orderly extraction of this region's mineral wealth. As night fell over Devil's Canyon Pass, the true horror of Blackwood's strategy became apparent. The corrupted wolves that had been brought as psychological weapons were released in the darkness, not to attack the trading post directly, but to create a circle of anguish around Lakota that would test the limits of his spiritual transformation. These magnificent predators had been subjected to the same brutal conditioning that had once corrupted him, and their presence filled the night air with sounds of confusion and pain that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the natural world. Through the bond they shared, Vera experienced Lakota's agony as he recognized voices and scents from his original pack, siblings, cousins, and hunting companions who had been twisted into weapons against everything they had once represented. The spiritual connection that allowed them to share thoughts and emotions became a conduit for torment as Lakota struggled with the knowledge that his freedom had come at the cost of his family's enslavement. But something unprecedented began to happen as the corrupted wolves surrounded the trading post. Instead of maintaining the aggressive postures their conditioning demanded, they began to respond to Lakota's presence with behaviors that suggested their original natures were reasserting themselves. The spiritual energy radiating from the sacred bond between Vera and Lakota was having the same liberating effect on the other wolves that Nahuel's presence had once had on Lakota himself. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. One by one, the corrupted pack members began to reject their conditioning and remember what they had been before human cruelty had twisted their natures. Their howls of confusion and pain evolved into calls of recognition and joy as they rediscovered their true identities and their connection to the brother who had escaped the fate that had been forced upon them. Blackwood's carefully planned psychological warfare began to collapse as his living weapons turned against their handlers with the fury of creatures who had finally remembered what they were fighting for. The professional wolf handlers he had brought to control the pack found themselves facing predators whose loyalty could no longer be commanded through fear and brutality. The systematic conditioning that had taken months to establish was shattered in minutes by the power of spiritual bonds that transcended human understanding. The battle that erupted in the darkness was unlike anything Vera had ever witnessed or imagined. Wolves who had been forced to serve human masters turned on their oppressors with savage determination, while the humans who had thought themselves in control discovered that some forces could not be contained by conventional methods. The night air filled with sounds of combat that seemed to echo from the primal conflicts between civilization and wilderness that had defined the American frontier experience. As dawn approached, and the sounds of battle began to subside, Vera found herself facing a decision that would determine not only her own fate, but the future of every living being who had been caught up in the conflict between competing visions of what the American West should become. Blackwood, wounded but still dangerous, had barricaded himself in a position where he could kill both Lakota and several members of the liberated wolf pack before being overwhelmed by their superior numbers. The governor's final gambit was designed to ensure that even defeat would serve his larger purposes. By forcing Vera to choose between saving Lakota and protecting the other wolves, he hoped to break the spiritual bonds that had made their resistance possible and demonstrate that such mystical alliances were ultimately inferior to the practical realities of political power and military force. But Vera's response transcended the limitations that Blackwood's worldview had led him to expect from a mere frontier woman. Drawing on reserves of courage and wisdom that seemed to flow from her connection to forces larger than individual survival, she made a choice that honored both love and justice without requiring the sacrifice of either principle. Instead of accepting Blackwood's false dilemma, Vera stepped into the line of fire herself, using her own body to shield both Lakota and the liberated wolves, while creating an opportunity for Nahuel to neutralize the governor's threat through precisely aimed rifle fire. The risk was enormous, but it was calculated on the understanding that some bonds were too sacred to be broken by fear of death. The moment of choice revealed the true power of the spiritual partnership that had been forged through the Modoc ceremony. As Vera placed herself in mortal danger to protect those who depended on her, Lakota's love and loyalty blazed through their connection with intensity that seemed to stop time itself. In that suspended instant, woman and wolf became something greater than the sum of their individual parts. A living embodiment of the harmony between human consciousness and natural wisdom that Mateo Rainsong had spent his life trying to achieve. When the crisis finally resolved and the immediate danger had passed, Vera realized that the conflict at Devil's Canyon Pass had been about far more than the fate of one woman and her wolf companion. It had been a test of whether the spiritual values represented by their partnership could survive in a world increasingly dominated by those who saw nature as nothing more than a resource to be exploited and controlled. The silence that followed. The final gunshot was not the empty quiet of death, but the profound stillness of transformation. Governor Blackwood lay motionless among the rocks where Nahuel's precision rifle work had ended his reign of terror, while around the trading post 7 liberated wolves moved with the wonder of creatures rediscovering what it meant to be free. Their conditioning had been shattered so completely that they seemed almost uncertain how to exist without human commands driving their every action. Vera knelt in the center of this transformed world, her arms wrapped around Lakota's powerful neck as both woman and wolf processed the magnitude of what had just occurred. Through their spiritual bond, she could feel his overwhelming relief at seeing his pack siblings released from the corruption that had defined their existence for so many years. But beneath that joy lay deeper currents of emotion. Grief for the time that could never be recovered, uncertainty about what their future would hold, and a profound gratitude that seemed to encompass not just her actions, but the entire chain of events that had led to this moment of redemption. The liberated wolves approached them with cautious reverence, their behavior suggesting they recognized that the human woman before them was responsible for their newfound freedom. One by one, they touched their muzzles to Vera's outstretched hands, in gestures that seemed more like formal acknowledgement than simple animal greeting. Each contact sent ripples of connection through the spiritual bond she shared with Lakota, allowing her to glimpse fragments of their individual stories, years of forced obedience, memories of the wildlife they had lost, and tentative hope for whatever lay ahead. Nahuel moved among the aftermath with the purposeful efficiency of a warrior accustomed to cleaning up after battles, but his actions carried ceremonial significance that transformed practical necessity into something approaching sacred ritual. As he gathered the weapons of their fallen enemies, he spoke prayers in the Modoc language that seemed designed to release the spirits of the dead from any lingering connections to the violence they had perpetrated. Even Clayton Reeves, whose scarred face bore the permanent mark of a lifetime devoted to cruelty, received the blessing of words meant to guide lost souls toward whatever redemption might be possible in the world beyond death. The federal marshals who had survived the conflict departed with the quiet haste of men who understood that their official reports would require creative interpretation of events that defied conventional explanation. They carried with them wounded comrades and the certain knowledge that the territorial government's plans for systematic exploitation of Native American mysticism had suffered a defeat that would ripple through political circles for years to come. As the immediate crisis faded into memory, Vera found herself confronting questions about the future that seemed to require wisdom beyond her 27 years of frontier experience. The trading post that had been her home and livelihood lay, partially destroyed by the siege, its wooden walls scarred by bullet holes, and its supplies scattered by the chaos of battle. More importantly, the isolation that had once provided safety now felt like vulnerability. Too many people knew about her spiritual partnership with Lakota, and too many interests had been threatened by their successful resistance to government authority. The liberated wolf pack presented both opportunity and challenge in ways that Vera was only beginning to understand. These magnificent predators had chosen to remain in the vicinity of the trading post rather than disappearing into the wilderness, their behavior suggesting they saw her as more than just the instrument of their freedom. Through her bond with Lakota, she could sense their desire for guidance and leadership that would help them navigate a world where their supernatural abilities made them valuable to some humans and terrifying to others. Nahuel approached the question of their future with the long-term perspective of someone whose people had been dealing with the consequences of white expansion for generations. "The territorial government will send investigators," he warned, his dark eyes reflecting knowledge gained through bitter experience. "They'll want to understand what happened here, how their plans were defeated, and most importantly, how to prevent similar resistance in the future. This place is no longer safe for anyone whose existence challenges their vision of progress." But the Modoc warrior's assessment also contained suggestions for alternatives that spoke of possibilities Vera had never considered. "There are places in the high country where my people still maintain the old ways," he explained. "Sacred valleys where the spirits remain strong and the white man's laws cannot reach. You and Lakota could find sanctuary there, along with the pack he has been given to protect. It would mean leaving everything you've known, but it would also mean joining something larger than individual survival." The choice Nahuel was describing wasn't simply a matter of geography. It was a decision about which world Vera wanted to inhabit. She could attempt to rebuild her trading post and return to the life she had known, accepting the constant threat of government interference and the isolation that came from possessing abilities that most people couldn't understand. Or she could embrace the spiritual transformation that her bond with Lakota represented and become part of a community that honored such connections as sacred rather than dangerous. Lakota's response to this dilemma came not through their mystical bond, but through actions that demonstrated his own understanding of the choice they faced. The great wolf moved to where Vera sat among the ruins of her former life and placed something at her feet. A small leather pouch that contained items from her father's collection of Native American artifacts. He had somehow preserved these objects through all the chaos of battle, recognizing their importance not as curiosities, but as links to the spiritual heritage that was calling to her through the blood of generations. That night, as Vera sat beside a campfire, surrounded by 7 liberated wolves and 2 humans who had become her chosen family, she experienced the most vivid and detailed vision that had ever visited her consciousness. But unlike the dreams that had prepared her for Lakota's arrival, this glimpse of the future felt less like prophecy and more like invitation. a preview of what could be achieved if she possessed the courage to embrace possibilities that transcended the limitations of her previous existence. In the vision, she saw herself standing in a hidden valley where ancient pines reached toward skies, unmarked by the smoke of industrial progress. Around her moved not just Lakota and his liberated pack, but dozens of other wolves who had been freed from various forms of human corruption through the spiritual techniques she was learning to master. Children played among these magnificent predators with the fearless joy of beings who had never learned to see nature as enemy rather than ally. The valley was home to a community that seemed to represent the best aspects of both Native American and frontier traditions. People who combined practical skills for wilderness survival with spiritual practices that honored the sacred connections between all living beings. Vera saw herself teaching young women how to establish bonds with wolf companions, while Nahuel trained young men in the warrior disciplines that protected such communities from those who would destroy them out of fear or greed. But the most remarkable aspect of the vision was its revelation of the broader purpose that her partnership with Lakota was meant to serve. The spiritual techniques they were pioneering weren't limited to relationships between humans and wolves. They could be extended to other species, other forms of consciousness, other ways of bridging the gaps that industrial civilization had created between human awareness and natural wisdom. The work they were beginning could eventually transform the entire relationship between humanity and the living world. The vision also showed her the challenges that lay ahead, expeditions of soldiers and scientists who would seek to capture or destroy what they couldn't understand, political campaigns designed to discredit their work as dangerous superstition, and the constant need to balance openness with security as they built something unprecedented in the modern world. But these difficulties seemed manageable when weighed against the profound sense of purpose that flowed through every aspect of the imagined future. When the vision faded and Vera returned to full awareness of her present circumstances, she found Lakota watching her with amber eyes that seemed to reflect starlight from sources beyond the visible sky. Through their bond, she could feel his understanding of what she had experienced and his willingness to follow whatever path she chose. But she could also sense his hope that her choice would honor the sacrifice made by his father's original companion and the potential that their partnership represented for healing wounds that had been festering since the first conflicts between indigenous wisdom and colonial conquest. The decision, when it finally crystallized in Vera's consciousness, felt less like a choice and more like recognition of what had already been determined by forces larger than individual will. She would leave the ruins of her trading post behind and accept Nahuel's invitation to join the community that waited in the sacred valleys of Modoc territory. But more than that, she would embrace her role as a bridge between worlds, someone whose spiritual partnership with Lakota could serve as a model for others seeking to heal the divisions that threatened to destroy both human and natural communities. The process of departure took 3 days, during which Vera carefully selected the items that would accompany her into her new life. Her father's collection of Native American artifacts claimed pride of place, along with the tools and supplies that would be necessary for establishing herself in a wilderness community. But she also chose objects that represented her connection to the frontier world she was leaving: her mother's Bible, her grandfather's woodworking tools, and the Winchester rifle that had served her so faithfully during the siege. The liberated Wolfpack seemed to understand that a great journey was beginning, and their behavior during the preparation days suggested eager anticipation rather than anxiety about unknown challenges. They had experienced enough of human cruelty to appreciate the magnitude of what Vera was offering them. Not just freedom from corruption, but membership in a community that would honor their true nature rather than exploit it for purposes they couldn't comprehend. On the morning of their departure, Vera stood for the last time in the ruins of the trading post that had been her home for 3 years. The bullet-scarred walls and broken windows bore testimony to the violence that had marked the end of one chapter of her life. But they also represented the beginning of something unprecedented in the history of human-animal relationships. She had chosen love over fear, spiritual wisdom over material security, and hope over the cynicism that marked so much of frontier existence. The journey into the high country began with a ceremony that Nahuel conducted to honor both the life Vera was leaving behind and the one she was choosing to embrace. As the sun rose over Devil's Canyon Pass, he spoke prayers that seemed to transform the trading post ruins into a shrine, not to defeat and destruction, but to the power of spiritual bonds to overcome even the most determined opposition. The wolves added their voices to his words, creating harmonies that seemed to carry across the mountain landscape like promises of transformation. As they finally began walking toward the distant peaks that concealed the sacred valleys of Vera's future, Lakota maintained his position beside her with the steady presence of a guardian whose loyalty had been tested by fire and found unbreakable. Through their bond, she could feel his contentment at finally being able to fulfill the purpose that his father's original companion had envisioned, serving as a bridge between human consciousness and natural wisdom in ways that honored both while diminishing neither. The story that had begun with a wounded wolf beside a water trough was ending with the birth of a new kind of community, one that combined the best aspects of frontier independence with the spiritual sophistication of traditions that predated European contact with the Americas. Behind them lay the wreckage of conflicts born from misunderstanding and fear. Ahead waited the possibility of healing wounds that had seemed permanent since the first moment when human ambition had declared war against the natural world. In the distance, other wolves called from hidden valleys where ancient wisdom still flourished, their voices carrying welcome for the pack that was finally coming home. And in the bond between woman and wolf that had made such homecoming possible, the spirits of all who had died fighting for the same vision seemed to whisper promises that their sacrifice had not been wasted. The covenant between human and animal consciousness had been renewed, and its power would grow with each passing season until the day when such partnerships would no longer be unusual miracles, but the foundation of a civilization worthy of the name. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.